Rock stars. Such an interesting bunch of people. They all look so striking and otherworldly. But one of these isn't actually a rock star. Any guesses? Well, if you said this guy, you'd be right. This is Jim Jarmusch, filmmaker. But he looks like a rock star, right? The white hair, the dark sunglasses, the black attire. Jarmusch is as prominent as any of the actual rock stars. But the question is, why? American filmmaker Jim Jarmusch is known for his minimalistic approach to filmmaking. He's made such films as these, and is a leading figure in the American independent scene. But his rock and roll goes much further than his appearance. Some would say his films evoke a rock and roll mood. But what exactly is rock and roll, outside of the distorted guitars and pounding drums? Well, to some, rock is an ethic, a rejection of the rules of the mainstream, a celebration of yourself, and the art of being a rock star. So join me as I break down how Jarmusch conveys rock and roll in three ways: his plot, his production of his films, and finally, thematically. In an interview with The Guardian, Jarmusch states, "I always think of the Sex Pistols and the Ramones as very, very important, because they stripped things down." He refers to their direct, no-strings-attached sound. Both bands are just that, a band. A bunch of people with instruments making noise. There's no studio trickery or abstract sounds. They are, in the kindest way possible, basic. The same could easily be said for the plots of Jarmusch's films. I mean, what really happens in films like Stranger Than Paradise or Patterson? These films are both intentionally lacking in story and instead are about the characters and mood. Sure, stuff does happen, but there's no real drama or grand build-up to the third act. Jarmusch's early films can be categorised as no wave. The no wave cinema movement was a short-lived underground movement based in New York City. No wave films are very stripped back, emphasising mood and feeling above plot or messages. Guerrilla filmmaking characteristics result in low budgets and skeleton crews. A lot of the locations are real, and props are, for the most part, whatever the filmmakers could find. Jarmusch's first two films, Permanent Vacation and Stranger Than Paradise, fit into this movement. Tying this back to rock music, the movement was inspired by a similar one that happened to music in the late 70s. No-wave music is described as an avant-garde subgenre of punk, characterised by its rejection of radio-friendly riffs. The texture of the songs is more important than a straightforward melody. Therefore, many of the songs feature repetitive drums and the abandonment of tonal music. Like no-wave films, no-wave music is nihilistic, perhaps even miserable to some. Attach that sentiment to Jarmusch's early films, and it so clearly matches. The worlds of his first two films are bleak and grim, with only short bursts of happiness. Jarmusch's first footsteps into the filmmaking world were defined by the no-wave movement. The line between musician and director is blurred. Sometimes rock takes the forefront of the plots. Mystery Train, Jarmusch's 1989 film, has three different plots, each tied to the King, Elvis Presley. From A Couple of Fans, to Elvis's Ghost, to an Elvis lookalike, Jarmusch loves the rock genre so much that it can inform the direction of his stories. But rather than affecting the plot itself, the inclusion of rock is more to see how the characters react. Speaking of character versus plot, Jarmusch states, "I always start with characters rather than with a plot, which many critics would say is very obvious from the lack of plots in my film. Although, I think they do have plots, but the plot is not of primary importance to me, the characters are." I reiterate, the plots in his films are very stripped back. The drama comes from the characters and not so much the events. Perhaps Jarmusch is creating his own rock stars. Every band has members, but how many have actual rock stars? The ones that grab your attention and leave you spellbound. You care as much about their personality as you do the music. Well, many Jarmusch characters have this iconography about them. Ghost Dog, Nobody, Eva. Each one is the driving force in their own plot. Sometimes these characters are played by actual rock stars too, which brings us on to the next part of our video. Tom Waits has appeared in multiple Jim Jarmusch films, his biggest role being in Down by Law. And while he's primarily known for his jazz-based music, his music did adopt some rock elements in the 80s onwards. Jarmusch brought on Waits for his 1991 film Night on Earth. While it is mostly rock music, the soundtrack offers some variety too, matching the story of the film, which tells 5 different vignettes based in 5 different cities. The music fits the different moods, and Jarmusch crafts a film that is as sporadic as the unpredictable music. But perhaps the most synonymous rock star with Jim Jarmusch is part-time stooge and full-time maniac Iggy Pop. Iggy's appeared in 3 films of his: Dead Man, Coffee and Cigarettes, and The Dead Don't Die. The Stooges were also the subject of his 2016 documentary, Gimme Danger. But more on them later. Jarmusch made another rockumentary, this time for Neil Young, filming his 1996 tour with Crazy Horse. This was to say thank you to Young for making the soundtrack to Dead Man the year prior. Young's score is guitar dominated and was mostly improvised as you watched the film. Jarmusch encouraged this as it matched his film's spontaneous nature. In that sense, you can compare Dead Man to a live performance. Now, imagine for me you're at a rock concert. The songs, as great as they are, never sound exactly like the studio version. Unless, of course, they're miming, which isn't very rock and roll of them. But whatever, I digress. In the live setting, a guitarist might improvise, adding parts here and there. Or maybe the singer will change some words around. The basis is there, yes, but suddenly liberties are taken, and the song becomes a wholly unique version of itself. This is how Dead Man plays out, especially when compared to other westerns. It's subversive and unlike any other within the genre, due to its surrealism and stark black and white cinematography. In fact, the film is as subversive as Neil Young himself, making him a great choice on Jarmusch's part. Jarmusch has scored some of his own films too, being a part of the band Squirrel. So earlier on, when I said that he wasn't a rock star, I lied, but please, bear with me. Squirrel, formed in 2009, have since scored all of Jarmusch's films. Making your own music to your film is quite rock and roll, playing into that do-it-yourself motif, evocative of lo-fi and garage rock bands. DIY music spawned from the 70s punk scene to avoid mainstream labels. It's about keeping control of your own music and out of the hands of some money-hungry label boss. Not that Jarmusch has lacked control over his films in the past. Quite the opposite, really. He's been very lucky that studios have respected and supported his auteur style, but him making his own music just adds this other layer of authorship to his films. Whether it's through the actors he chooses or the music, it seems that his love of rock and roll just effortlessly bleeds into the films that he makes, showing that music and his taste in music has a direct influence on his role as a director. But let's look at it more broadly. What does this say about his use of themes and ideas in his films? Rock, like most other genres, can encompass a range of themes, like love, death, politics, but let's focus specifically on artists we know that Jarmusch loves, many of which have songs that create a distinct mood based on a certain place or a certain era. Take 1969 by the Stooges, for example. I told you we'd get back to them. Iggy and the gang paint a clear picture of the frustration, disenchantment and overall boredom felt by the youth at that time. The hippie phase was coming to an end, and young people were stuck in tiny dead-end towns with no real purpose. This song... The song is a bit of a kickback to that idea, and as many people will tell you, the Stooges were one of the precursors to the punk movement. Hell, it's what gave Iggy the nickname the Godfather of Punk. To make a song as relatable as 1969, the Stooges were saying, "We hear you and we agree." Sure, the song was written by one person and gave one perspective, but it represented so much more. Another one of Jarmusch's musical heroes is Neil Young. Young has many songs that tell a specific story or detail a specific place. Some of his best, like Down by the River and Cortez the Killer, evoke precise and vivid images, some that can make the listener feel like they're really there. But the song that best does this, in my opinion, is the song Helpless. Written by Young and released under Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, Helpless is a nostalgic yearning for the small town of Omemee in northern Ontario. This is where Young grew up. Young describes it fondly in the song as a place where all his changes were.
With dream, comfort, memory, despair, and in my mind, I still need a place to go. 'Cause all my changes were there.
But the song is in fact a bittersweet exploration of his memories there, as it was here that Young got polio aged 6, hence the repeated refrain and title, Helpless.
Helpless, helpless, helpless.
And if you need an example for Elvis Presley, then maybe this will suffice.
Viva Las Vegas! Viva Las Vegas!
So, what's all this got to do with Jarmusch then? Well, he uses locations in a very similar way. While I'll avoid the cliche phrase that the location becomes a character, I will say that locations are treated with as much importance as the characters themselves. His film Paterson personifies the town of Paterson through the main character who has the same name. The city of Memphis is the star of Mystery Train. The city houses the 3 separate stories and explores the characters' different viewpoints of it. In the first story, the characters have travelled there purposefully. To them, it represents a pilgrimage of sorts, due to its ties to Elvis. The second story follows a woman stranded there. She is in Memphis, but not by choice. Therefore, we see her being taken advantage of in some ways, from buying magazines she doesn't want, to the guy trying to impress her. The final story follows 3 people who already live in Memphis. They are familiar with the city, so to them it's a playground. They act wild and get drunk. They walk into the hotel and get a room easily because they're locals. Contrast this to the other characters. The first story's couple don't fully understand the desk clerk at first due to language barriers, and the woman in the second story must share with someone she doesn't know. Jarmusch explores how the same city can have completely different effects on a person, giving you and I, as viewers, a full 360 view of this place. By the time the credits roll, we have become residents ourselves. He can also show a bittersweet nostalgia for his hometown, or in this case, home state. Jarmusch was born and raised in Ohio, where much of Stranger Than Paradise takes place. The characters, Willie and Eddie, visit Ohio in search of Eva. Jarmusch portrays Cleveland as a more hopeful place. Eva is there, Willie's family is represented by his aunt, and having a more sociable side, like being at the movies. But soon the characters get bored again, and we get the most important line of the film.
You know, it's funny. You come someplace new and everything looks just the same.
Jarmusch views his hometown in the same way that Neil Young does in the song Helpless. Just because somewhere is home doesn't mean that it's without its flaws, but at the same time, it's still home. There's that yearning and love for it, despite all the problems. But what about rock and roll in Jarmusch's terms? Well, to him, the best rock bands have what he refers to as the stupid factor. This is when a rock band fully embraces the sheer stupidity of their success and just rolls with it. Jarmusch states it's a good thing. It means they're saying, we're no more serious than you are, this is just rock and roll, so here we go. To Jarmusch, having the stupid factor leads to a greater amount of authenticity. There has to be a little bit of the stupid factor, otherwise it's too elitist or condescending. When rock and roll people seem like they're looking down on you because they're a little bit above you, they've lost the essence of rock and roll. This last part is especially apparent in the types of stories that Jarmusch tells. This relatability and sense of being on the same level can be seen in his down-to-earth characters and realistic plots. Take a film like Down by Law, for example. It's a very street-level film, following just 3 everyday, unremarkable people. In fact, these characters probably remind you of someone in real life. The only bit that isn't ordinary and realistic is when they break out of prison, but this scene is omitted from the film entirely. On top of that, Jarmusch's 2016 film Paterson is as slice of life as you can get, following the week in the life of a bus driver named Paterson. There is no plot in the traditional sense. Instead, the narrative follows the normal day-to-day life of the titular character. And I would argue that anybody watching the film would find at least one similarity to their own life. Jarmusch is therefore a filmmaker of the people. In the same way that elements of rock music, like punk rock, act as voices of the people, Jarmusch's films seemingly represent the voice of people struck by the mundanity of everyday life. But what about the stupid factor itself? Can this be translated into Jarmusch's films? Well, yeah, sure it can. I mean, he followed up Patterson with a zombie film. The Dead Don't Die embraces this fun and stupid idea, playfully homaging previous zombie films as it diverts the genre, even breaking the fourth wall at points. An earlier film like Dead Man, while mostly a serious revisionist western, also has some sparks of amusement dotted throughout, mainly coming from the main character having the same name as the poet William Blake, which, side note, leads to this badass scene.
You William Blake?
Yes, I am. Do you know my poetry?
Ghost Dog explores this too, as an American hitman adopts the way of the samurai in order to inform his own code of conduct. It just sounds mental. Jarmusch has fun with his characters in the same way that rock stars have fun with their personas, where both have this cheeky edge to them. From Pete Townsend smashing his guitars, Bob Dylan's interactions with the press, and Liam Gallagher being, well, Liam Gallagher.
I've got 4 GCSEs, mate, I'm not silly.
Ultimately, what makes Jarmusch and rock music so intertwined is the fact that he's a fan. He loves music, and even admits at one point that he wished he'd been a musician instead. But rock music specifically has significant meaning to him. It has soundtracked most of his life, and now he uses it to soundtrack his own films. Jarmusch once said that music is the purest form of expression. So as a filmmaker, obviously he's going to be inspired by the music that he listens to. The director no doubt uses his films as an expression of himself, so by utilising rock music, he can take this even further. And in that sense, Jarmusch's films are like musical projects. The scores, the casting, the stripped-back nature of the filmmaking, and even the stupidity. He blurs the line between musician and filmmaker. Jim Jarmusch truly is a rock star director.